I woke up to complete darkness, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The type you only get when every electronic hum in your house suddenly dies at once. My name is Kevin Patterson, and I had lived in the Riverside Meadows community in Aurora, Colorado, for about 3 years at that point. It was February, and we were in the middle of one of those brutal cold snaps that occasionally reminds Coloradans that winter is not to be messed with. The temperature had dropped to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the power grid had finally given up under the strain of everyone cranking their heat to maximum. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time. 4:30 in the morning. Great. I pulled on a sweatshirt and some thick socks, then made my way downstairs. The house was already getting cold. I could see my breath in the ambient light coming through the windows from the snow outside. Thank goodness I had prepared for exactly this scenario. About 6 months earlier, I had purchased a decent-sized portable propane heater and several 20-pound propane tanks. I kept them stored in my garage, properly secured and away from any ignition sources, exactly as the safety guidelines recommended. I had done my research, made sure everything was up to code, and even checked with the HOA guidelines before making the purchase. There was nothing in our community rules that prohibited storing propane for emergency heating purposes. I headed to the garage and flipped the light switch out of habit. Nothing happened, obviously. I used my phone flashlight instead and walked over to where I kept my emergency supplies. The heater was there, right where I left it, but something was wrong. The 3 full propane tanks I had lined up against the wall were gone. Only one remained, and it was the empty one I had been planning to refill. I stood there staring at the empty space, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. I had just checked these tanks 2 days ago. I distinctly remembered thinking how glad I was to have them ready to go if the power went out, which the news had been warning about for the past week. Someone had taken them. Someone had come into my garage and stolen my propane tanks. My first thought was that maybe I had moved them and forgotten, but that made no sense. My second thought was a break-in, but my garage door was still locked from the inside. Then I remembered the side door. I walked over to check it. The door was closed but unlocked. I always kept that door locked. Always. My mind raced through the possibilities. The only people who had keys to my house were my parents, who lived in Nebraska, and the HOA management for emergency purposes. The HOA key thing had always bothered me a bit, but it was in the contract I signed when I bought the house. They promised it was only for genuine emergencies like fire or flooding when I could not be reached. I went back inside and tried to think logically about this. Maybe someone broke in through the side door, but there were no signs of forced entry when I examined it more closely with my flashlight. The lock worked fine. Someone had simply opened it with a key, or I had forgotten to lock it, which seemed unlikely given my usual habits. The cold was becoming more noticeable now. Without heat, my house would become uninhabitable pretty quickly in this weather. I needed those propane tanks. I checked my phone and saw that I had no internet connection. The cell towers were probably overwhelmed, or some were without power too. I managed to get a text message to send to my neighbor, Frank, asking if his power was out too. He responded a few minutes later confirming the whole neighborhood was dark. I asked if he had seen anyone around my house. He said no, he had been asleep until the power went out. As dawn started to break, I decided to do something I had installed last summer but never really thought I would need for something like this. I had a security camera system with local storage backup. The cameras were wired to a battery backup system that could keep them running for about 72 hours without main power. I had set it up primarily because there had been some package thefts in the neighborhood, and I wanted to protect my deliveries. I went to the small office room where I kept the network video recorder. The battery backup was working perfectly, and the unit was still running. I sat down and started scrolling through the footage from the previous evening and night. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just my quiet house and empty driveway. Then, at around 2:15 in the morning, just a couple hours before the power went out, I saw something that made my blood boil. A figure appeared in the camera view walking up my driveway. The motion-activated light should have come on, but the power must have already been out by then, or was flickering. The person was carrying a large flashlight and moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. They walked right past my front door and headed toward the side gate that led to my backyard and the side entrance to my garage. The camera covering that side of the house picked up the next part. The person opened the gate, which I realized with frustration I had left unlocked, and walked directly to my garage side door. They pulled out a set of keys, found the right one after only 2 tries, and let themselves in. About 10 minutes later, they emerged carrying one of my propane tanks. They walked it back through the gate and down the driveway out of view. Then they came back and repeated the process twice more until all 3 of my full tanks were gone. The video quality was not bad despite the darkness. My cameras had decent night vision. As the person walked back down the driveway on their final trip, they turned slightly toward one of the cameras, and I got a clear view of their face. It was Brenda Carmichael, the president of our HOA. I sat back in my chair, absolutely stunned. Brenda Carmichael was exactly what you would picture if someone said the words, HOA Karen. She was in her early 50s, always wore her blonde hair in the same severe bob, and had a permanent expression that suggested she had just smelled something unpleasant. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a live, laugh, love sticker on the back window, and she had a reputation in the neighborhood for being absolutely relentless about rule enforcement. I had my own history with Brenda. 6 months ago, she had tried to fine me because my grass was allegedly a 1/4 inch too tall according to the HOA guidelines. I had to measure it in front of her with a ruler to prove it was within the acceptable range. She had looked genuinely disappointed that she could not write me up. Then, there was the time she complained about my truck being parked on the street overnight, which was supposedly against the rules. I pulled out the HOA bylaws and showed her that overnight parking was allowed for up to 72 consecutive hours. She had argued with me for 20 minutes before finally stomping away. But this was actual theft. She had used her HOA master key to enter my property and steal my emergency supplies during what was shaping up to be a genuinely dangerous situation. This was not about some petty rule enforcement. This was a crime. I saved the video footage to 3 different locations, including a cloud backup, once my internet came back on briefly, and my phone regained signal. I was not taking any chances with this evidence. As the morning progressed, the temperature in my house continued to drop. I put on multiple layers and wrapped myself in blankets, but it was not sustainable. I needed heat, and I needed it soon. I tried calling Brenda's number, which I had saved from previous HOA-related correspondence. It went straight to voicemail. Brenda, this is Kevin Patterson from 847 Riverside Drive. Someone broke into my garage last night and stole my propane tanks. I have security footage of the incident. I need to speak with you immediately about HOA key security. Call me back as soon as possible. I kept my voice level and professional, giving away nothing about what I had actually seen on the footage. I wanted to see what she would do, how she would respond. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Brenda. "Kevin, I got your message," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "That's terrible about your propane. Have you called the police?" "Not yet," I replied. "I wanted to speak with you first about who has access to the HOA master keys. The door was unlocked from the inside, so either I forgot to lock it, which I really don't think happened, or someone used a key." There was a pause. "Well, I have a set of keys as HOA president, and the management company has a set, but we would never use them without proper cause. Are you sure you locked your door?" "Pretty sure," I said. "Can you tell me where you were last night around 2 in the morning?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't appreciate your tone, Kevin. Are you accusing me of something?" "I am just trying to figure out what happened," I said calmly. "My emergency heating supplies were stolen during a dangerous cold snap." "I think that is a reasonable question to ask about key access." "I was at home, asleep, like any normal person at that hour," she said sharply, "and I find it quite offensive that you would even suggest such a thing. If you have a problem, you should file a report with the police and let them investigate properly." "I plan to," I said. "Thank you for your time, Brenda." I hung up before she could respond. Her defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. She was not going to admit to anything, and she was going to play the offended party. The power was still out, and my house was now down to 48 degrees inside. I could not stay here. I packed a bag and drove to my friend Marcus's place in Denver, about 30 minutes away. His power was still on and he had a spare bedroom. He welcomed me in without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need, man," Marcus said, handing me a cup of coffee. "That's crazy about your propane tanks. You really think your HOA president took them?" "I don't think," I said. "I know. I have video of the whole thing." His eyes widened. "No way. What are you going to do?" "I am going to the police," I said. "This is straight-up theft. I don't care if she is HOA president." The next morning, the power was back on in my neighborhood. I drove back home and immediately went to the Aurora Police Department. I brought my laptop with the saved security footage. The officer at the front desk directed me to file a report with Officer Janet Morrison, who handled property crimes. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. "Tell me what happened," she said, opening up a report form on her computer. I walked her through everything. The power outage, discovering my tanks missing, the unlocked door, and then the security footage. She watched the video carefully, her expression growing more serious as it played. "That's pretty clear footage," she said. "You can identify this person?" "Absolutely," I said. "That's Brenda Carmichael. She lives at 923 Riverside Drive, just a few streets over from me. She is the president of our homeowners association." Officer Morrison raised her eyebrows. "She used an HOA key to enter your property?" "That's my belief," I said. "The door was locked, there was no forced entry, and the HOA has master keys to all properties for emergencies." "That's quite a violation of trust," she said, shaking her head. She took down all the information and gave me a case number. "I will need to speak with Miss Carmichael and investigate this. In the meantime, I would recommend changing your locks if you are concerned about security." "What about my propane tanks?" I asked. "I need those, especially if the power goes out again. If we can locate them and confirm they are yours, we will get them back to you," she said. "Do you have any identifying marks on them or receipts?" I did. I had dated the tanks with a paint marker when I bought them, writing my initials and the purchase date on each one. And I had the receipt from the hardware store saved in my email. "That will help," Officer Morrison said. "I will be in touch once I have spoken with Miss Carmichael." 3 days later, Officer Morrison called me. "Mr. Patterson, I went to speak with Miss Carmichael. She denied taking your propane tanks. However, when I mentioned that we had video evidence, she became quite flustered. She eventually admitted that she did take them, but she claims it was not theft. How is it not theft? I asked incredulously. She claims that under the HOA Emergency Powers Clause, she had the authority to redistribute resources during a community emergency situation. She says she took your tanks to provide heating for elderly residents who did not have alternative heat sources. I was speechless for a moment. That's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. That's not a real thing. She stole my property. I agree with you, Officer Morrison said. I have reviewed the HOA bylaws, and there is no such clause that would authorize the taking of personal property without consent, regardless of the circumstances. I informed Miss Carmichael that she committed theft and I could arrest her. Could? I asked. She has offered to return the tanks and compensate you for the violation. She's trying to avoid criminal charges. But that's your call, Mr. Patterson. You are the victim here. Do you want to press charges, or would you prefer restitution? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to see her face charges. She had violated my property and trust in the worst way. But another part of me knew that getting into a prolonged legal battle might be more trouble than it was worth. What kind of restitution are we talking about? I asked. That would be between you and her, but I can facilitate the conversation if you would like. Generally, in cases like this, the standard is to return the stolen property and compensate for any damages or inconvenience. I want to think about it, I said. Can I get back to you? Of course. You have time. The case is still open. I spent the rest of the day researching my options. I looked into small claims court, HOA law, and property theft statutes in Colorado. What I found was interesting. In Colorado, theft of property valued between $500 and $1,000 was a Class II misdemeanor. Each of my propane tanks had cost about $60 when full, so 3 tanks was $180 in propane alone. Add in the value of the tanks themselves and the refill costs, and we were probably around $250 to $300 total. But there was another angle I had not considered. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Richard Chen, and he had excellent reviews online. He agreed to a phone consultation. So she used her HOA authority to commit theft? Richard asked after I explained the situation. That's exactly what happened, I confirmed. This is interesting, he said. You could pursue this as a criminal matter, which it clearly is. But you also have a civil case here for violation of your property rights, abuse of HOA authority, and possibly intentional infliction of emotional distress, given that she took emergency supplies during a dangerous weather event. What would that look like? I asked. You could file a lawsuit seeking actual damages, which would be the value of what was taken plus any costs you incurred as a result of not having the propane. But you could also seek punitive damages, which are designed to punish particularly egregious behavior. A jury might be very sympathetic to a homeowner whose HOA president stole their emergency heating during a blizzard. How much are we talking potentially? Hard to say. Actual damages are probably minimal, a few $100s at most, but punitive damages could be thousands. It depends on how much the jury wants to make an example of her behavior. And here is the thing. If you win, she would likely have to pay your attorney fees too. That got my attention. So I could potentially come out ahead. Very possibly. But here is my advice. Before you go down the lawsuit road, try to negotiate with her directly. Use the threat of both criminal prosecution and a civil suit as leverage. See if you can get her to agree to significant compensation voluntarily. If she refuses to be reasonable, then you can pursue legal action knowing you tried the reasonable approach first. What would be reasonable compensation? I asked. Richard thought for a moment. In retail theft cases, stores often demand 2 or 3 times the value of stolen merchandise to avoid prosecution. It serves as both compensation and punishment. In your case, triple damages would be around $700 to $900, plus the return of the actual tanks or equivalent replacements. That seems fair given the circumstances. I like that idea. How should I approach her with this? Put it in writing. Send a formal demand letter laying out what happened, what you want, and what will happen if she does not comply. Be professional but firm. Give her a deadline, maybe 7 days to respond, and make it clear that you have video evidence and have already filed a police report. Can you help me write this letter? Absolutely. That's a simple flat fee service. $250, and I will draft a proper demand letter for you. I agreed, and 2 days later I had a professionally written demand letter. It was beautifully done, laying out all the facts in clear legal language and demanding the return of 3 full 20-pound propane tanks or equivalent value, plus $900 in punitive damages within 7 days, or I would proceed with both criminal prosecution and a civil lawsuit. I sent it via certified mail so there would be proof of delivery. Then I waited. 5 days later, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I answered it cautiously. "Is this Kevin Patterson?" a man's voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Brenda Carmichael. I am Brenda's husband." "We need to talk about this letter you sent." "Okay," I said. "I am listening." "Look, Brenda made a mistake," he said. "She panicked during the power outage. Her mother lives 2 streets over and did not have any heat. Brenda was worried about her freezing, so she thought if she borrowed some propane tanks from around the neighborhood, she could keep her mother warm until the power came back on. She did not borrow them," I said firmly. "She stole them in the middle of the night without asking or telling me." "That's theft, not borrowing." I know, he said, sounding tired. "I told her it was a bad idea, but she did not listen. She just acted. That's how she is. She sees a problem and tries to fix it without thinking through the consequences." "That's not an excuse," I said. "And it does not explain why she denied it when the police first talked to her." "She was scared," Dennis said. "She realized she messed up big time. Look, we don't want this to turn into a huge legal thing. What do you want, really?" "I want exactly what my letter said. 3 full propane tanks and $900. That's triple the value of what was taken, which is standard for theft cases." $900 seems excessive, he said. "Does it?" I replied, my anger rising. "She stole my emergency supplies during a life-threatening weather event. I had to leave my house because I had no heat. I could have frozen if I did not have somewhere else to go. And she did this while abusing her authority as HOA president, using a key that was supposed to be only for actual emergencies. This is about as bad as HOA behavior gets." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "You're right," he finally said. "It's inexcusable. I will talk to Brenda. We'll get you the tanks and the money." "You have 2 days left on the deadline," I reminded him. "We'll have it to you tomorrow," he promised. True to his word, the next afternoon Dennis showed up at my door. Brenda was not with him. He looked embarrassed as he handed me 3 full 20-pound propane tanks and a check for $900. "I am really sorry about all this," he said. "Brenda is too, even if she has trouble admitting it. She's been under a lot of stress with the HOA and her mother's health issues." "I appreciate the apology," I said, meaning it. Dennis seemed like a decent guy caught in the middle of his wife's bad decision. "But Brenda needs to understand that being HOA president does not give her the right to do whatever she wants. This could have been so much worse." "I know," he said. I have been telling her she needs to step down from the HOA board. This job brings out the worst in her. After he left, I examined the tanks to make sure they were actually full and not just empty returns. They were full, and the check was good, drawn on their personal checking account. I called Officer Morrison to let her know the situation had been resolved through restitution. "That's good to hear," she said. "But I want you to know that Miss Carmichael is still on record as having committed theft. If anything like this happens again, this prior incident will count against her. And I had a serious conversation with her about abuse of HOA authority. She's on thin ice." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate you taking this seriously. Property rights matter," she said simply. "HOA or not, nobody has the right to take what isn't theirs." I thought that was the end of it. I had my propane back. I had been compensated for the violation, and presumably Brenda had learned her lesson. But I should have known better. HOA Karens don't learn lessons that easily. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter from the HOA. It was a notice of violation and a fine for $250. The violation: improper storage of flammable materials in attached garage in violation of Community Safety Guidelines, Section 7.3.2. I read the letter 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. Brenda was actually trying to fine me for the very propane tanks she had stolen from me. The nerve was absolutely breathtaking. I immediately pulled out my HOA bylaws and read Section 7.3.2 carefully. It stated that flammable materials must be stored in accordance with local fire codes and manufacturer guidelines. That was it. There was no prohibition on storing propane in garages. And I knew for a fact that my storage setup was completely compliant with both the fire code and the manufacturer's recommendations. I took photos of my propane storage area, showing the tanks properly secured, upright, away from any ignition sources, and stored exactly as they should be. Then I drafted a response letter to the HOA. In it, I detailed how my storage was completely compliant with all applicable codes and guidelines. I pointed out that the HOA bylaws did not actually prohibit what I was doing. And then I added a paragraph that I knew would get under Brenda's skin. Furthermore, I find it highly inappropriate that this violation notice comes just 2 weeks after HOA President Brenda Carmichael was found to have stolen these very same propane tanks from my property, an incident that was investigated by the Aurora Police Department and resolved through mandated restitution. This violation notice appears to be retaliatory in nature and an abuse of HOA authority. I will not be paying this fine, and if the HOA pursues this matter, I will have no choice but to bring the theft incident to the attention of all homeowners in the community. I sent copies to Brenda and to the other 2 members of the HOA board, Linda Matthews and George Torres, neither of whom I had much interaction with before. The response came not from Brenda but from George. He called me directly. "Kevin, this is George Torres from the HOA board. I just got your letter about this propane fine situation." "Hi, George," I said. "I assume you read the whole thing." "I did," he said, and he sounded troubled. "I need to ask you something directly. Did Brenda really steal your propane tanks, like actually steal them?" "Yes," I said. "I have video footage of her using the HOA master key to enter my garage at 2 in the morning and removing 3 propane tanks. The Aurora police investigated. She was forced to return the tanks and pay triple damages to avoid criminal charges." "Holy hell," George muttered. "I had no idea." "She never mentioned any of this to the board." "I am not surprised," I said. "And now she is trying to fine you for having the tanks she stole. That's exactly what's happening." "That's beyond unacceptable," George said. "Listen, I am going to call an emergency board meeting. This fine is going to be voided, and we need to have a serious discussion about Brenda's conduct as president. I appreciate that, George. No, thank you for bringing this to our attention. If she is abusing her authority like this, who knows what else is going on that we don't know about? 3 days later, I received an email from Linda Matthews, the HOA secretary, informing me that the fine had been officially voided and withdrawn. The email also mentioned that there would be a special HOA board meeting the following week, and any homeowners who wished to attend were welcome. I definitely planned to attend. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse on a Tuesday evening. When I arrived, the small meeting room was already packed. Apparently, word had gotten around the neighborhood that something significant was happening with the HOA board. Brenda sat at the head table looking furious. Linda and George sat on either side of her, both looking uncomfortable. George called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We have some important matters to discuss tonight regarding HOA governance and leadership conduct. Before we begin, I want to read a statement on behalf of the board." He pulled out a paper and began reading. "It has come to the attention of the HOA board that our president, Brenda Carmichael, engaged in serious misconduct involving the unauthorized entry into a homeowner's property and the taking of personal property. This incident was investigated by local police and resolved through restitution. However, Mrs. Carmichael failed to disclose this incident to the board and subsequently attempted to issue a retaliatory fine to the affected homeowner. After careful consideration, the board has determined that this conduct is incompatible with the duties and responsibilities of HOA leadership." The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Brenda's face had gone bright red. George continued, "We are calling for a vote of no confidence in President Carmichael and requesting her resignation from the board." "This is ridiculous," Brenda burst out. "I've given 3 years of my life to this community. I work harder than anyone to maintain our property values and enforce our standards. One little mistake and you are going to throw me out. One little mistake." I could not help myself from speaking up. "You stole my property and then tried to fine me for having it." "I was trying to help my mother," Brenda shot back. "She could have frozen to death. But no one cares about that. You just care about your precious propane tanks." "I care that you committed a crime," I said. "And then you abused your position to try to punish me for catching you." Linda spoke up. "Brenda, if you had just asked Kevin if you could borrow his propane, I'm sure he would have said yes. But you snuck into his garage in the middle of the night like a thief, because that's what you were." "A thief? How dare you?" Brenda hissed at Linda. "I dare because it's true," Linda replied calmly. "And I am tired of you treating this HOA like your personal kingdom where you can do whatever you want. I have been on this board for 2 years, and I have watched you bully people, make up rules that don't exist, and act like you are above the very guidelines you are supposed to enforce." Other homeowners started speaking up, sharing their own stories of Brenda's overzealous and often arbitrary rule enforcement. There was the couple she tried to fine for having a political sign in their yard during an election, which was actually protected speech. There was the man she reported to the city for a supposed code violation that turned out to be completely fabricated. There was the woman she harassed for weeks about her mailbox paint color being slightly off from the approved palette, even though the difference was barely noticeable. Story after story came out, painting a picture of someone who had been drunk on the tiny amount of power that came with being HOA president. Brenda tried to defend herself, but she was shouted down. Even people who had previously been neutral or uninvolved were angry now that they knew the full extent of her behavior. Finally, George held up his hand for quiet. "We are going to take a vote. All homeowners present are eligible to vote on whether to remove Brenda Carmichael from the HOA board. This requires a 2/3 majority according to our bylaws." The vote was not even close. Out of the 47 homeowners present, 42 voted to remove her. Only 5 voted to keep her, and I suspected those were just her close friends who could not bring themselves to vote against her. Brenda stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You want to run this place without me? Good luck. You'll see how fast things fall apart. And you," she pointed at me, "I will never forgive you for this." "I can live with that," I said quietly. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Dennis, who had been sitting quietly in the back, got up and followed her out. He gave me an apologetic look as he left. The rest of the meeting was actually productive. George was elected as the new HOA president. Linda remained as secretary, and they appointed Frank, my neighbor, to fill the vacant board position. One of the first orders of business was to implement new policies about the HOA master keys. They would now require 2 board members to agree before the keys could be used for any entry, and any use of the keys would be logged and reported to homeowners at the next meeting. They also formed a committee to review all outstanding violations and fines to make sure they were legitimate and properly documented. It turned out that Brenda had issued quite a few questionable fines over the years, and many of them were quietly withdrawn. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different. There was less tension, less of that feeling that you were constantly being watched and judged. People started actually enjoying their homes instead of worrying about every tiny detail that might attract HOA scrutiny. I ran into Dennis one day at the grocery store. He looked tired but relieved. "How is Brenda doing?" I asked, not because I particularly cared, but because it seemed like the polite thing to ask. "She is struggling," he admitted. "She really identified with being HOA president. It gave her a sense of purpose, I think. Now she is trying to figure out what to do with herself." "I am sorry it had to end that way," I said, and I meant it. I had not wanted to destroy anyone's life. I just wanted my property respected. "Don't be," Dennis said. This was bound to happen eventually. She was getting more and more extreme with the HOA stuff. It was becoming unhealthy. Maybe this will be a wake-up call for her to find something else to focus on, something that does not bring out her worst impulses. "I hope so," I said. "And Kevin," he added. "Thanks for not pressing criminal charges. That could have been so much worse for her." "I just wanted to be made whole," I said. "I am not trying to ruin anyone's life." We parted ways, and I thought about what he had said. The truth was, the whole situation had been a good reminder about power and how it can corrupt people, even in small ways. Being in charge of an HOA was not real power in the grand scheme of things, but to someone like Brenda, it had been enough to make her feel entitled to do things she never should have done. A month after the vote, I got an interesting piece of mail. It was from the HOA, but it was a check, not a bill. The memo line said refund of improperly assessed fines. It was for $150. I called George to ask about it. "Oh yeah," he said. "When we reviewed the files, we found that Brenda had fined you twice over the past 2 years for violations that were not actually violations. The grass height thing and something about your holiday decorations being up too long, even though they were within the allowed time frame. We are refunding everyone who got hit with bogus fines." "That's awesome," I said. "How many refunds are you issuing?" 23 households, he said, totaling almost $4,000. "It's coming out of the HOA reserve fund, but we will recover it from Brenda if we have to." She signed documents attesting that these fines were legitimate. "Is that fraud?" I asked. Our lawyer says it might be, but we are trying to handle it internally first. Brenda has agreed to repay the HOA over time. She really does not want more legal trouble. Fair enough, I said. As spring arrived and the weather warmed up, things continued to improve in the neighborhood. The new HOA board was responsive and reasonable. They focused on actual community improvements instead of petty rule enforcement. They organized a neighborhood cleanup day that actually brought people together instead of dividing them. I kept my propane tanks properly stored in my garage, and nobody said a word about them. In fact, a few other neighbors asked me for advice on setting up their own emergency heating supplies. The power outage had been a wake-up call for a lot of people about being prepared. One Saturday afternoon in May, I was out front washing my truck when a car I did not recognize pulled up. A woman in her 70s got out and walked up my driveway. It took me a moment to recognize her as Brenda's mother, whom I had seen around the neighborhood a few times. "Mr. Patterson," she said tentatively. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Margaret Winters, Brenda's mother. I wanted to talk to you if you have a moment." "Of course," I said, setting down my sponge. "What's on your mind?" I wanted to apologize, she said, and I could see she meant it. I had no idea what Brenda did to get that propane. She told me she had borrowed it from some extras the HOA had purchased for emergencies. I only found out the truth a few weeks ago. I feel terrible that my situation led to her making such poor choices. "Mrs. Winters, this was not your fault," I said firmly. "Brenda made her own decisions. You were cold and needed heat. That's not the problem. The problem was how she went about getting it." "I know," she said, "but I still feel responsible somehow. If I had been better prepared myself, maybe none of this would have happened." "We all learned from this," I said. "Have you gotten your own emergency supplies now?" "I have," she said with a small smile. "Dennis helped me set up a propane heater of my own, and I have several tanks properly stored in my shed. If the power goes out again, I'll be ready and Brenda won't have to try to save me." "That's great," I said. "That's really all any of us can do. Be prepared and look out for each other, but in ways that are actually legal and ethical." She laughed softly at that. "You are very gracious, Mr. Patterson. Brenda could learn a lot from you about handling conflict." After she left, I thought about the whole situation. It had started with theft, escalated to HOA drama, resulted in someone losing their position, and now was ending with apologies and reconciliation. It was strange how things could spiral and then resolve. The following week, I got one more surprise. There was a letter in my mailbox handwritten from Brenda. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. It said, "Kevin, I owe you an apology that I have been too proud to give until now. What I did was wrong. I violated your property and your trust. I abused my position as HOA president. And when I got caught, instead of owning up to it like an adult, I tried to punish you for exposing me. I have spent a lot of time thinking about why I acted that way, and I don't have a good answer except that somewhere along the way, I started thinking that being in charge meant I was always right. I forgot that my job was to serve the community, not rule over it. I am genuinely sorry for what I did to you. You had every right to press charges, and I am grateful you did not. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I understand if you cannot. Brenda." I read the letter twice. It seemed sincere, though part of me wondered if Dennis had pushed her to write it. Either way, it was something. An acknowledgement, an apology, maybe even the beginning of actual change. I never responded to the letter. I figured it had been hard enough for her to write it, and sometimes the best response is just to accept the apology and move on. I did not need to be friends with Brenda. I did not even need to interact with her much since she was no longer on the HOA board. but I could accept that she had apologized and hope that she would do better going forward. Life in Riverside Meadows went back to normal, or rather, to a new and improved version of normal. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, maintaining common areas and handling necessary business without the drama and overreach that had characterized Brenda's tenure. I ran into Brenda one more time, about 3 months after everything had gone down. It was at the neighborhood 4th of July cookout. She was there with Dennis and her mother. When she saw me, she looked like she wanted to turn around and leave, but Dennis put his hand on her arm and said something to her. She walked over to where I was standing by the grill. "Hi, Kevin," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Hi, Brenda," I replied. "How have you been?" "Better," she said. "I've been volunteering at the animal shelter downtown. It's been good for me. Turns out I like working with dogs a lot more than I liked being on the HOA board." "That's great," I said, and I meant it. "Dogs are much less complicated than neighborhood politics." She actually smiled at that, that's for sure. "Anyway, I just wanted to say hi. I know things have been awkward between us." "Water under the bridge," I said. "You apologized, you made restitution, and everyone moved on. That's how it should work." "Thanks," she said quietly. "That means a lot." She went back to her family, and we both went on with enjoying the cookout. We were not friends, probably would never be friends, but we had reached a point where we could exist in the same space without tension. That was enough. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the whole strange journey. It had started with me waking up in a freezing house and discovering my propane tanks missing. It had escalated into police reports and HOA drama and angry confrontations. But it had ended with accountability, change, and even a measure of redemption. The security camera footage had been the key to everything. Without that video evidence, it would have been my word against Brenda's, and as HOA president, she might have been able to spin the situation in her favor. But the cameras did not lie. They showed exactly what happened, and that made all the difference. I thought about other homeowners in other communities who might not have the same documentation, who might be victims of HOA abuse without any way to prove it. It made me grateful that I had taken the time and spent the money to install a good security system. That investment had paid for itself many times over, not in money but in justice and accountability. The $900 I had received in restitution sat in my savings account. I thought about what to do with it. Part of me wanted to just keep it as compensation for the stress and hassle. But another part of me wanted to do something meaningful with it. I decided to donate it to a local charity that helped low-income families with home repairs and emergency preparedness. It seemed fitting that money from a dispute over propane tanks during a power outage would go toward helping people who might not be able to afford their own emergency supplies. When I made the donation, I included a note explaining where the money came from and why I was giving it. The director of the charity called me personally to thank me and told me they would use the funds to purchase emergency heating supplies for families in need. That felt right. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned several important lessons. First, always document everything. Security cameras, receipts, written communications, all of it matters when disputes arise. Second, know your rights and the actual rules that apply to you. Brenda had relied on people not checking the HOA bylaws carefully or understanding what she could and could not do. Third, stand up for yourself, but do it through proper channels. I could have handled the situation much worse, but by going to the police and following legal procedures, I had kept the moral high ground. And finally, I learned that accountability matters. Brenda had operated for years with minimal oversight, making up rules and enforcing them arbitrarily. It was only when her behavior became so egregious that it crossed into actual crime that people finally paid attention and took action. But once they did, change happened quickly. The new HOA board continued to do good work. They were transparent about their decisions, they communicated clearly with homeowners, and they focused on actual community needs instead of petty enforcement. Property values in the neighborhood actually went up once word got around that the tyrannical HOA president was gone and reasonable people were in charge. As for my propane tanks, they sat in my garage, properly stored and ready for the next emergency. The power grid in Colorado continued to be stressed during peak times, and there were a few more outages over the next year, though none as severe as that February cold snap. Each time the power flickered, I felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing I was prepared, and that my preparations were my own, protected by law and proper behavior. I never had another significant interaction with Brenda. She kept to herself mostly, focused on her volunteer work and her family. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and Dennis were doing well, that she seemed happier and less stressed now that she was not consumed with HOA responsibilities. Dennis became something of a friend. We would occasionally chat when we ran into each other, and he was always friendly and open. He never made excuses for what Brenda had done, but he also clearly loved his wife and was glad that she had found a better path forward. Margaret, Brenda's mother, became surprisingly friendly toward me. She would wave when she drove by, and once she even brought me some cookies as a thank you for being understanding about the whole situation. I tried to tell her it was not necessary, but she insisted. They were good cookies. The Riverside Meadows community continued to thrive. New families moved in, attracted by the reasonable HOA and the friendly neighborhood atmosphere. Old tensions faded as people realized they could just live their lives without constant scrutiny and judgment. George did an excellent job as HOA president. He was fair, approachable, and focused on solving actual problems rather than creating new ones. Under his leadership, the HOA organized several successful community events, negotiated better rates on landscaping services, and even got a new playground installed in the common area. Linda and Frank were equally effective in their roles. The three of them worked as a real team, making decisions collectively and always keeping homeowners informed. It was like night and day compared to Brenda's one-woman show approach. 1 year after the propane incident, the neighborhood had its annual meeting to elect HOA board members and discuss the state of the community. I attended, more out of civic duty than any particular concern. George gave a report on everything the board had accomplished over the past year. It was an impressive list. At the end of the meeting, George made a point of talking about governance and accountability. 1 year ago, this community went through a difficult transition, he said. We had to confront the fact that our HOA had lost its way. But instead of letting that tear us apart, we came together and made changes. We implemented new policies, new oversight, and most importantly, a new culture of transparency and respect. I am proud of what we have accomplished, and I am grateful to everyone who has been part of making this community better. There was genuine applause. People appreciated the positive changes and the leadership that had made them possible. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me to chat. A few of them thanked me for standing up to Brenda and starting the process that led to her removal. I deflected the thanks, pointing out that I had just been protecting my property, but they insisted I had done the community a service. Someone needed to hold her accountable, one neighbor said. You were brave enough to do it. I did not feel particularly brave. I just felt like I had done what anyone would do when their property was stolen. But I appreciated the sentiment. As I walked home that evening, I felt a sense of satisfaction about how things had turned out. Justice had been served, changes had been made, and the community was better for it. My propane tanks had been the catalyst for all of it, in a strange way. 3 20-pound cylinders of liquid propane had sparked a revolution in neighborhood governance. I thought about all the HOA horror stories I had heard over the years, stories of people being fined into bankruptcy, having liens placed on their homes, being bullied and harassed over trivial matters. My story could have been one of those horror stories. But it was not, because I had documentation, I knew my rights, and I was willing to stand up for myself through proper channels. The video footage had been crucial, absolutely crucial. I shuddered to think what would have happened without it. Brenda would have denied everything. I would have had no proof, and the whole thing might have escalated into a nasty, she said battle that could have dragged on for months or years. But the cameras had captured the truth, clear and undeniable. And that truth had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately made things better for everyone, including Brenda herself, who seemed genuinely happier now that she was not consumed with HOA drama. The check for $900 had been symbolic as much as practical. It was triple damages, a recognition that what she had done was serious and deserved real consequences. But it was also finite, a one-time payment that settled the matter and allowed everyone to move on. That balance between accountability and mercy had been important. I learned from the experience that justice does not always have to involve maximum punishment. Sometimes the goal is restoration rather than destruction. Brenda had faced consequences. She had lost her position, paid restitution, faced public embarrassment, and had to confront her own behavior. Those were real and significant consequences, but they were not life-destroying. She had been able to apologize, make amends, and move forward with her life in a better direction. That seemed right to me. I had never wanted to destroy Brenda. I just wanted my property back and assurance that it would not happen again. Mission accomplished on both counts. The experience also made me more aware of HOA governance in general. I started paying attention to board meetings and elections. I reviewed financial statements and asked questions when something did not make sense. I became an engaged community member rather than just a passive resident who paid dues and hoped for the best. Other neighbors did the same. The crisis had awakened a sense of civic responsibility in the community. People realized that HOAs only work well when homeowners pay attention and hold leaders accountable. Brenda's abuse of power had happened in part because people were not paying attention. Now they were, and that made all the difference. As time went on, the whole incident became just another part of neighborhood history. New residents would hear about it when they moved in, usually framed as a cautionary tale about why the community took HOA governance so seriously now. It became the answer to the question of why there were so many checks and balances on HOA authority in Riverside Meadows compared to other communities. I kept my security cameras running and regularly backed up the footage. You never know when you might need evidence of something. The cameras had already paid for themselves once. I hoped I would never need them that way again, but I was glad to have them just in case. My propane tanks remained in my garage, properly stored and regularly checked. I rotated through them, using them for my outdoor grill in the summer and keeping them ready for emergency heating in the winter. They were a constant reminder of that strange February night when everything had started, but they were also a symbol of preparedness and self-reliance. Every now and then, when a storm was coming or the weather forecast predicted extreme cold, neighbors would ask me for advice on emergency preparedness. I was always happy to share what I had learned. Several families set up their own propane heating systems based on my recommendations. We became a more resilient community, better able to handle whatever Colorado weather threw at us. The whole experience, as difficult and frustrating as it had been at times, had ultimately made me a better neighbor and a more engaged community member. It had taught me the importance of documentation, the value of knowing your rights, and the power of standing up for yourself in appropriate ways. It had also shown me that people can change. Brenda had been a nightmare as HOA president, drunk on tiny amounts of power and completely out of control. But after facing consequences, she had apparently found a better path. I did not know her well enough to say whether that change was deep and permanent, but at least she was moving in the right direction. As I sat on my porch one evening in late summer, cold drink in hand, watching the sun set over the mountains, I thought about how different things were now compared to that freezing February morning when I had discovered my propane tanks missing. The neighborhood felt lighter, friendlier, more like an actual community rather than a collection of houses governed by a petty tyrant. Change was possible. Justice was possible. Accountability was possible. All of it was possible when people decided to stand up for what was right and follow through with appropriate action. My security footage had made the difference between a he said, she said mess and a clear case of wrongdoing. Documentation mattered. Evidence mattered. Truth mattered. And in the end, truth had won out. Brenda had stolen my propane, the video had proved it, and she had been forced to pay triple damages and face real consequences for her actions. The system had worked, not perfectly perhaps, but well enough. Justice had been served, changes had been made, and life had gone on. The story of the stolen propane tanks became one of those neighborhood legends that gets told and retold, probably with embellishments over the years. But the core truth remained. An HOA president had abused her authority, a homeowner had stood up for his rights, and the community had ultimately chosen accountability over protecting someone just because they were in charge. That was the real lesson. Power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. But when people demand accountability and back it up with evidence and proper procedures, change happens. It might not be easy or comfortable, but it happens. My propane tanks sat in their designated spot, properly stored and ready for the next emergency. They had been stolen, recovered, and transformed into symbols of something larger than just emergency heating supplies. They represented the principle that nobody, not even HOA presidents, is above the law or entitled to take what does not belong to them. And that was a principle worth fighting for, worth documenting, and worth the $900 in triple damages that served as both punishment and deterrent. It was worth the awkward confrontations, the police reports, the HOA drama, and all the rest of it. Because at the end of the day, rights matter, property matters, and accountability matters most of all.